Welcome to the Deep Dive. If you're joining us today, you are likely someone who doesn't just accept the surface-level narratives handed down by mainstream media.
Right, you're looking for something deeper.
Exactly. You're a learner. You're looking for the unvarnished history of our institutions, specifically before they were allegedly captured by what some describe as feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Which is a huge topic.
It's massive. And if that sounds like you, do us a quick favor right now, hit that like button and subscribe to the platform you are listening on. It really helps us bring you these extensive, unfiltered explorations.
It definitely does.
Today, we have an absolute powerhouse of a deep dive for you. We're doing an exclusive review of a highly provocative, widely discussed new ebook published in 2025. It's called M.G.T.O.W, The New Masculine Frontier by Conrad Riker.
It's a heavy one.
Yeah, and I want to say right up front, to truly grasp the raw, unfiltered arguments that are currently shaping the modern men's rights and red-pilled manosphere movements, you need to read this primary source for yourself.
You really do. Summaries don't do it justice.
No, they don't. I highly encourage you to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book today. And make sure you follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
It is a dense, heavily layered text, and it's making waves for a very good reason.
Yeah, how does he frame it exactly?
Well, Riker frames this book as an edutainment manifesto. He's directly challenging and completely rejecting the modern concept of toxic masculinity, and he basically takes a sledgehammer to what is commonly known in these circles as the blue pill narrative.
The mainstream narrative.
Right. For those listening who might only be familiar with the mainstream media's portrayal of these concepts, Riker's work is an attempt to lay out a comprehensive, unified theory of modern gender dynamics from a strictly male advocacy perspective.
So over the course of this deep dive, we're going to trace the historical roots of what Riker calls gynocentrism.
We'll be looking closely at the evolutionary psychology of gender roles, the systemic decline of male spaces, and the erasing of men in the educational system.
Plus the modern economic landscape. And finally, the author's proposed solution, M.G.T.O.W, which stands for Men Going Their Own Way.
Yeah, it's a lot of ground to cover.
It is. And before we get started, we have a very clear mission today. Because this material contains highly politically charged content, we want to make it absolutely clear that we are not taking sides.
No, not at all.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the author or any political wing. Our goal today is strictly to impartially report on the contents of the book, unpack its arguments, and help you understand the ideas driving this specific cultural worldview.
We're just here to look at the text.
Exactly. Look at the data the author provides and break down the philosophy. Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the very foundation of Riker's argument. He introduces this overarching concept of the gynocentric matrix.
Yeah, the matrix.
Now, most of us hear the word matrix and immediately think of, science fiction with Keanu Reeves, but Riker is using it as a sociological framework.
He defines gynocentrism as a societal system that revolves entirely around women's needs.
But the kicker, the really controversial part of his thesis, is that he claims this system explicitly demands that men sacrifice themselves to maintain it.
With absolutely no return on their investment.
Right. So how exactly does he justify that claim historically? Because that's a bold claim.
It is the core thesis from which the rest of the book flows. And he spends a significant amount of time justifying it by looking backward.
Into history.
Yeah, he argues that this prioritization of women isn't a new phenomenon invented by modern feminism. Rather, it's deeply rooted in centuries of cultural conditioning that we've simply rebranded.
Okay, where does he start?
He starts his historical analysis with medieval chivalry.
Chivalry. Interesting.
Yeah, because in the modern consciousness, we think of chivalry as opening doors or paying for dinner. But Riker points out that in medieval Europe, the chivalric code was a rigid, often brutal social contract.
How so?
It placed women on a pedestal of purity and explicitly demanded that men lay down their lives to protect them. The expectation wasn't just politeness, it was a mandate for male disposability.
Male disposability.
Right. A knight or even a peasant conscript was expected to literally die in the mud to protect the women of the realm.
Wait, I need to stop you there because that's an interesting pivot. He's claiming medieval chivalry wasn't a privilege of the patriarchy, but actually a burden.
Yes.
How does Riker justify that, considering the historical power dynamics of the time where men were the kings, the lords, and the landowners?
It's a crucial distinction in his worldview. Riker argues that modern historians suffer from what is often called the apex fallacy in these circles.
The apex fallacy.
Though he frames it specifically around disposable utility, Yes, the absolute top fraction of 1% of society, the kings and dukes, held the power.
Right, the ruling class.
But Riker asks the reader to look at the other 99% of men. For the average man, society was not a playground of privilege, it was a meat grinder.
Wow.
He was a utility, expected to provide extreme physical labor, fight in wars he didn't start, and sacrifice his life for the safety of women and children.
So he's saying men have always been viewed strictly through the lens of utility.
Exactly. Riker argues that society has always viewed women as intrinsically valuable because of their reproductive capacity, while men have only ever been valued for their extrinsic utility.
What they can provide, build, or destroy.
Right,
That makes the transition to his next historical era make a lot of sense.
exactly. He then moves to the Victorian era, where he argues this medieval dynamic evolved into the idealization of the woman as the angel in the house.
The angel in the house, that was a very specific cultural framework.
It painted women as morally superior, delicate, and pure, while men were strictly relegated to the harsh, morally compromising role of navigating the brutal industrial world to provide for her.
And then he brings us to the 20th century.
To 20th century feminism. Riker's controversial argument here is that modern feminism didn't dismantle the traditional roles, it just cherry-picked them.
Cherry picked them.
He claims feminism took this historical chivalric protectionism, the idea that women must be safeguarded and provided for, weaponize it, and simultaneously stripped away any of the traditional respect, authority, or familial leadership that used to accompany the male provider role.
So he's essentially saying society kept the burdens of traditional masculinity, but eliminated the benefits.
That's his exact argument.
He compares this gynocentrism directly to androcentrism, right? The idea of a male-centric society.
Yes, he contrasts them heavily.
And if I'm reading his argument correctly, he is saying that over the last 50 years, any androcentric system, anything that catered exclusively to male needs or recognized male authority, has been deliberately dismantled.
Systematically.
But the gynocentric expectations that men must protect, provide, and sacrifice have been allowed to flourish completely unchecked.
That is precisely his point, and he argues that this asymmetry creates a staggering legal and social vulnerability for modern men.
Which leads us to the legal systems.
Right.
To illustrate how this theoretical matrix operates with devastating real-world consequences, Riker points to a very specific historical moment in the legal system: the creation of the Duluth model in 1981 in Duluth, Minnesota.
Now, for listeners who might not be familiar with the inner workings of domestic violence intervention, the Duluth model is arguably the most widely adopted framework in the world for handling domestic disputes by law enforcement and the courts.
It is a global standard.
And Riker attacks this model relentlessly. From what I read in the text, he doesn't just see it as a flawed psychological theory. He views it as the exact moment when gynocentric bias was literally codified into law.
Right.
Can you break down exactly what the Duluth model assumes, according to Riker, and why he believes it is so destructive?
Well, according to the text, the Duluth model was created by feminist activists, not objective sociologists, and it operates on a deeply ingrained ideological assumption.
That domestic violence is entirely a product of patriarchal control. Therefore, the model inherently assumes that in almost any domestic dispute, the man is the perpetrator attempting to assert dominance, and the woman is the victim attempting to defend herself.
It's an automatic default.
Right. Riker argues that this specific model institutionalized a severe systemic gender bias across global law enforcement. When police arrive at a domestic disturbance, they are essentially trained by this framework to view the man as the primary aggressor by default.
He provides some incredibly jarring hypothetical scenarios to back this up.
He does.
He argues that because the model assumes male guilt, it completely ignores the existence of male victims of domestic violence. And more importantly, it effectively strips men of their constitutional right to due process.
Because of how the police have to react.
Right. Riker lays out scenarios where a man could actually be the one calling 911 because he's being physically attacked by his partner. But when the police arrive, the Duluth model protocols dictate that the man must be removed from the home or arrested simply because of his size and gender to separate the parties.
And the fallout from that initial arrest, according to Riker, is catastrophic.
It ruins lives.
He argues that this is how a theoretical feminist concept was weaponized into concrete law. An arrest, even if charges are later dropped, creates a police record. It can immediately trigger an automatic restraining order.
And the consequences of that restraining order are huge.
Massive. Riker points out that this restraining order forces the man out of his own home, separates him from his children without a trial, and can often result in his immediate termination from his job if his employer has a strict moral turpitude or domestic violence policy.
So just an accusation handled through this model can destroy a man's livelihood.
He claims men are losing their jobs, their homes, their access to their children, and their life savings over what are often false or exaggerated accusations used strategically during divorces.
He asserts that the system is not designed to objectively investigate the truth and safeguard victims. It's designed to blindly penalize men.
It's a terrifying prospect, and he ties this directly into the broader family court system.
Yeah, if we look at how Riker extrapolates this, it's easy to see how these deeply ingrained cultural narratives, like the Victorian angel in the house who is pure and delicate, paired with the medieval knight who must sacrifice himself, get weaponized in a modern courtroom.
He spends an entire chapter dissecting family courts. Riker claims that family courts overwhelmingly favor women in custody battles and alimony rulings, not because women are inherently better parents, but because the judges and the legal precedents themselves are operating on this deeply embedded gynocentric operating system.
The Matrix in action.
Exactly. The court inherently views the woman as the delicate party who is entitled to resources and protection, and it views the man as the disposable utility whose primary, and perhaps only, value to his family is his ability to generate a paycheck.
So Riker is essentially arguing that modern society has kept the medieval requirement that men must sacrifice themselves for women, but they've updated the venue.
It's a modern battlefield.
Right. The sacrifice isn't happening on a muddy battlefield anymore. It's happening in a sterile divorce court where a man's financial future, his retirement accounts, and his legal right to see his own children are the casualties.
What's fascinating here is how Riker transitions from these legal and historical frameworks into the realm of biology.
Section 2.
Right. He argues that the legal and social frameworks we just discussed are not just unfair. They are fundamentally at war with our hardwired DNA.
That's a huge shift in the book's tone.
He believes that the reason society feels so fractured right now is because we're trying to legislate against human nature.
Let's dive right into that because Section 2 of the book, Evolutionary Psychology versus the Myth of Modern Equality, is where Riker lays out his foundational red pill truth.
And we should clarify for the audience, Riker doesn't use the term red pill just as internet slang.
No, he takes it very seriously.
He uses it to describe a rigorous awakening to biological reality. He argues that gender roles are absolutely not social constructs created by a patriarchy to oppress women, but are deeply embedded million-year-old biological imperatives.
So how exactly does he map out the evolutionary mating strategies for men and women?
He relies heavily on evolutionary psychology to make this case, focusing specifically on the concept of hypergamy.
Hypergamy. That's a term you see a lot in these spaces.
You do.
No.
Now, in Riker's framework, hypergamy is the deeply ingrained biological tendency for women to seek out and meet with men who are of higher socioeconomic status, who are stronger, and who have more resources than they do.
It's about securing survival.
According to the book, men and women have distinct, hardwired mating strategies that evolved over millennia to ensure human survival in incredibly harsh environments. Because raising human children is uniquely resource-intensive and leaves the mother physically vulnerable for years, women evolved to be biologically drawn to resources, status, and physical protectors.
They needed partners who could guarantee survival.
Exactly.
And on the flip side, what does evolutionary psychology say about men, according to Riker?
According to Riker, men are biologically drawn to youth and fertility.
Because that signals reproductive potential.
Right. From a purely evolutionary standpoint, those physical traits signal reproductive potential. A man's evolutionary imperative was to ensure his genetic lineage continued. So he naturally prioritized physical indicators of health and fertility over a woman's ability to gather resources, because he was already the primary resource provider.
So Riker's overarching argument here is that you simply cannot legislate these million-year-old instincts out of existence.
You can't just mandate them away.
He claims that the modern institutional push for absolute gender equality has massively backfired because it attempts to force humans to behave in ways that fundamentally contradict their DNA.
It creates a massive societal friction.
We live in a society that is actively demanding that men suppress their natural competitive alpha instincts. From a young age, boys are told that traditional masculine traits, aggression, stoicism, extreme competitiveness are toxic.
But the paradox Riker highlights, and he spends pages tearing into this, is that while society and the media tell men to be soft, accommodating, and emotionally vulnerable, women's biological hardware hasn't changed.
So what happens?
According to the book, women are still biologically attracted to those exact same dominant, assertive alpha traits. So this creates an entire generation of what he calls profoundly frustrated beta males.
Men who played by the modern rules.
Right. These are men who did exactly what society, their teachers, and the media told them to do. They became sensitive, they learned to step back, they suppressed their assertiveness, only to find themselves completely ignored in the dating market by the very women they were trying to appease.
He calls this the double bind of male vulnerability. And reading through his description of it, it sounds like an inescapable psychological trap.
It really does.
Modern culture constantly tells men that they need to open up, go to therapy, cry, and show their weaknesses. But Riker argues that this is a trap. Can you explain the mechanics of this double bind?
Well, Riker argues that the moment a man actually displays true vulnerability or weakness to his partner, he is severely penalized for it on a biological level.
Even if the woman asks for him to be vulnerable.
Even then, even if the woman consciously believes she wants a vulnerable man, her evolutionary hardware registers that vulnerability as a lack of capability and a failure to protect.
That is brutal.
It is. Riker cites numerous anecdotal and psychological studies suggesting that men who break down in front of their wives often report an immediate and permanent loss of respect and physical intimacy in the relationship.
So the man is caught in the bind.
He's constantly criticized by society for not being emotionally open enough, but the moment he displays traditional weakness, he is condemned and abandoned by his partner. There is no winning in a framework that demands you act against the biological expectations of your mate.
It makes you wonder what this means for the modern family unit. If men and women are fundamentally at odds, operating on conflicting societal and biological scripts, how does a marriage even survive?
According to the book, it doesn't.
Because Riker paints a pretty grim picture of the domestic landscape today.
He says the bedrock of society is already crumbling. Riker argues that radical feminism didn't just alter workplace dynamics to get women into the boardroom. It actively waged a psychological campaign to convince an entire generation of women that motherhood, domestic life, and reliance on a male provider were oppressive traps that should be despised.
The whole strong, independent woman narrative.
By heavily promoting the strong, independent woman who doesn't need a man narrative, the traditional family structure has been systematically broken down. And for Riker, the traditional nuclear family isn't just a quaint 1950s lifestyle choice. It is the fundamental, tested survival mechanism of the human species.
There's a part in the book that really stuck with me where he tries to strip away all the modern conveniences to prove this point. He uses the Yanomami tribe in the Amazon as a case study.
That was a vivid chapter.
He asks the reader to look at human nature completely outside of modern Western social conditioning, away from the HR departments and the suburban safety nets. Why does he focus on the Yanomami?
He uses them to illustrate the raw, undeniable biological necessity of traditional gender roles.
In a state of nature.
Right. In the harsh environment of the Amazon, where resources are incredibly scarce, where rival tribes are a constant threat, and where jaguars and disease are daily realities, the physical protection and resource gathering of the father are not optional, socially constructed roles.
They're essential.
They are a matter of absolute life and death for the children. If the men of the tribe decided to suddenly reject their toxic, aggressive instincts and embrace emotional vulnerability instead of perimeter defense, the tribe would be wiped out in a week.
That is a stark contrast. He's essentially asking the modern reader to look at the broad span of human history and realize that the very traits modern society labels as toxic masculinity, aggression, hyper-competitiveness, emotional stoicism in the face of danger, physical dominance, are the exact evolutionary traits that kept humanity alive long enough to build the modern, comfortable world that now condemns them.
It's the ultimate irony, in his view.
And he argues that when you tell an entire generation of men to reject these deep-seated instincts, you create a deeply sick society. Men feel completely adrift and useless, and women feel chronically unfulfilled and anxious because everyone is playing a synthetic role that goes completely against their biological nature.
Exactly. And the tension Riker is exploring is what happens when these hardwired biological truths crash head-on into the modern institutions that govern our lives today.
And he doesn't think this clash is accidental.
No, he argues that this clash is being engineered.
So what does this all mean for the institutions we rely on? Because Riker doesn't just stop at theoretical psychology. He takes a magnifying glass to the systems we interact with every day.
Let's get into the institutional purge.
Let's do it. specifically focusing on the education system and what he calls the deliberate erasure of male spaces.
This is where Riker's arguments move from the biological into the heavily systemic and data-driven. He mounts a rigorous, documented attack on the modern educational system, arguing that from kindergarten through the university level, education has been functionally captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies that actively seek to dismantle male identity.
And he brings receipts for this?
He does. To back this up, he cites a highly detailed 2020 study by the National Association of Scholars. According to the data presented in the book, 70% of high school history textbooks now focus overwhelmingly on women's achievements and minority struggles.
70%.
Meanwhile, the monumental historical contributions of men from the founding of nations to the Industrial Revolution to major scientific breakthroughs are systematically minimized, recontextualized as acts of oppression, or completely erased from the curriculum.
That is a massive ideological shift in how history is taught. And Riker's very clear that he believes this is a deliberate, coordinated strategy.
It's not just an oversight.
Right. He says the goal of modern educators isn't just to add historically overlooked women to the record. The goal is to fundamentally rewrite history so that men are painted exclusively as tyrannical oppressors and women are painted as perpetual heroic victims.
And the fallout from this psychological conditioning on young boys is staggering.
He pulls a 2022 Department of Education study showing a 10% drop in male college enrollment over just the past decade.
10% in a decade.
And he poses the obvious question: why are young men simply dropping out of the academic system en masse?
His answer is that they're actively disengaging because the system is openly hostile to them. They're tired of being shamed for their gender.
Every single day.
They're tired of sitting in classrooms where they are treated as inherently problematic from day one, and where their historical identity and the achievements of their ancestors are erased or vilified.
He makes an interesting point about learning styles, too.
Right. Riker argues that the modern classroom is designed to cater exclusively to the learning styles and behavioral temperaments of young girls who generally sit still, follow instructions, and excel at agreeable social interaction,
While penalizing boys.
while heavily penalizing the natural, boisterous, physically active learning styles of young boys.
And it gets even more direct and insidious with what he describes as toxic masculinity workshops, which are becoming mandatory in many high schools and universities.
Oh, the workshops. He spends a lot of time on those.
Imagine the psychological impact on a 14-year-old boy. Riker argues that in these workshops, natural male behaviors like physical energy, a desire for rough and tumble play, competitiveness, and assertiveness are literally pathologized.
They're treated like symptoms of a disease.
Exactly. They are treated as symptoms of a societal disease. Boys are being trained by ideologically driven educators to view their own natural instincts as dangerous and immoral.
It is a total inversion of the educational mission. Instead of taking the raw energy of young boys and channeling it into discipline, mastery, and leadership, which is what education used to do, the system is designed to tear their identity down.
It's a suppression tactic.
Riker claims that modern teachers are essentially taught in their credentialing programs to view young boys as potential predators in waiting, and young girls as perpetual victims who need to be shielded from male energy.
So if boys are dropping out of the educational system because it's hostile, where do they go? Historically, men always had outside physical sanctuaries.
But Riker argues those are gone too.
Let's talk about his research on the systematic dismantling of physical male spaces.
Historically, men across all cultures have always required sanctuaries where they could gather away from women to share wisdom, engage in unrestricted male banter, and forge deep bonds of brotherhood and mentorship.
The proverbial men's club.
Riker points to the dramatic, statistically verified decline in fraternal organizations. He uses the Freemasons as a prime example.
The numbers on that are crazy.
In 1959, the Freemasons had over 4 million active members in the United States. Today, that number has plummeted to just 1 million, and the average age of a member is well over 60.
It's a dying breed.
He argues this isn't just the loss of a quaint social club, it is the total collapse of the vital social scaffolding that provided young men with cross-generational mentorship, a sense of purpose, and a network of brotherhood.
But I want to make sure I am following his logic here, because he doesn't just blame a lack of modern interest for the decline of these spaces. He points a very specific finger at legislation.
Yes, Title IX.
Title IX, which was passed in 1972. Now, we're all taught that Title IX was a landmark civil rights law to ensure gender equity in federally funded education. But Riker calls Title IX a Trojan horse. How does he justify that?
He justifies it by tracking how the law was applied outside of its original intent. Riker argues that while it was sold to the public as a simple way to ensure girls got equal funding for school sports, it was quickly and aggressively weaponized by activist lawyers
Weaponized against who?
against male-only spaces to dismantle any and all male-only sports teams, clubs, and private organizations across the country.
Like the Boy Scouts?
He uses high-profile examples like the Boy Scouts of America, the iconic centuries-old men's clubs in London, and the Union League Club in New York.
Places that have been around for generations.
These were bastions of male bonding, networking, and tradition that were repeatedly sued, publicly vilified, and financially starved until they were forced to dilute their male-only policies or face absolute ruin.
And here is where Riker points out a glaring, almost absurd double standard that I think will resonate with a lot of readers. While traditional male-only spaces were being relentlessly attacked and forced to integrate by law, modern women-only spaces were allowed to flourish,
They were celebrated.
highly celebrated by the media. He points to modern women-only co-working spaces and social clubs like The Wing, which were praised in magazines as empowering, necessary safe spaces for women to escape the patriarchy. How does Riker reconcile that hypocrisy in the text?
He says the hypocrisy isn't a bug. It's the defining feature of the gynocentric matrix.
The rules are different depending on your gender.
Exactly. The cultural message is crystal clear. Women are heavily encouraged to have exclusive spaces to build solidarity, share resources, and protect themselves. But men are explicitly forbidden from having spaces of their own because in the eyes of the modern culture, male exclusivity is inherently threatening.
The assumption is always nefarious.
Whenever men gather privately without female supervision, society assumes they are plotting oppression. This relentless legal and cultural pressure effectively forces men into total isolation, stripping them of real-world sanctuaries where they can speak freely and find mentors.
And it isn't just physical spaces. Riker notes that the very language we use is being scrubbed of male identity.
The shift to gender-neutral language.
Right. He points to the aggressive shift toward gender-neutral language over the last 20 years, changing fireman to firefighter or policeman to police officer or mankind to humankind.
He argues this isn't just about workplace inclusion.
No, he says it's a deliberate psychological effort to blur the lines between men and women and culturally deny the biological realities that make male-specific experiences, particularly in dangerous physical professions, unique.
And he pairs this with the removal of classic, rugged male authors.
Like Ernest Hemingway, Jack London, Mark Twain from high school reading lists, replacing them with modern feminist literature. He claims this actively robs boys of the chance to see themselves, their struggles, and their inherent desire for adventure reflected in the broader culture.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the loss of these physical spaces, the erasure of cultural identity, and the hostility in education isn't happening in a vacuum. It heavily influences a man's ability to navigate the world financially.
The financial angle is where he really connects the dots.
The educational system is directly tied to earning potential, and networking clubs were historically tied to career advancement. When you strip those away, you attack a man's wallet.
Which brings us perfectly to section 4 of our deep dive, the economics of gynocentrism and globalized misandry.
This section is eye-opening.
If men are actively being pushed out of these educational and physical spaces, you have to wonder how that impacts them financially. And Riker actually dedicates a massive portion of the book to following the money.
His economic arguments are incredibly sharp.
He points out a massive, undeniable statistical disparity in modern capitalism. According to the data in the book, women drive roughly 70 to 80% of all consumer spending in the global economy.
Think about that number.
70 to 80%. Yet, despite this massive financial power and independence, the traditional societal expectation that men must foot the bill remains firmly, stubbornly in place.
It is a profound contradiction that exposes the reality of the modern dating market.
The asymmetry we talked about earlier.
Women demand absolute equality in the workplace. They demand equal representation in corporate boards, and they celebrate out-earning men. But Riker points out that when the check comes at a restaurant, or when it's time to pay for a vacation, a diamond ring, a wedding, or certainly when assets are divided in a divorce, the traditional gender roles instantly reappear like magic, and the man is fully expected to pay.
He describes modern dating not as traditional courtship, but as a heavily rigged financial minefield, or in some cases, outright extortion.
That's where he brings in the sugar baby culture.
I have to admit, when I first read the chapter on sugar baby culture being compared to extortion, it felt incredibly jarring. But when you look at the 70 to 80% consumer spending data he pairs it with, you start to see the economic puzzle he's putting together.
He argues that apps and social media have created a culture where women are actively and openly monetizing relationships and their mere presence.
While men are being financially bled dry just for the opportunity to interact.
And this economic and cultural marginalization has severe, measurable mental health consequences.
It's not just complaining about money, it costs lives.
Riker uses international data to make a stunning point about what happens when these policies are taken to their absolute extreme on a global scale. He looks at Sweden.
Sweden is the perfect test case for his theory.
Now, in the Western media, Sweden is constantly hailed as a feminist utopia and the absolute global gold standard for gender equality. But Riker pierces that narrative by citing 2020 data showing that Swedish men commit suicide at 3 times the rate of Swedish women.
That is a horrific statistic. How does Riker connect a high suicide rate directly to gender equality policies? What is the specific mechanism there?
He argues that this isn't a tragic coincidence. It is the direct result of systemic marginalization. The aggressive state-sponsored push for a gender equality utopia in Sweden has created a society where men feel entirely stripped of their purpose.
How does state policy strip their purpose?
He specifically unpacks the mechanics of state-mandated paternity leave. While on paper it sounds incredibly progressive to force men to take months off work to care for an infant, Riker argues that in practice it often leaves men professionally penalized and culturally emasculated.
Because they're removed from the workforce.
They are removed from their competitive drive in the workplace, forced into a maternal role that conflicts with their biology, while the state essentially replaces them as the primary provider.
The state becomes the husband.
Exactly. The extreme pressure to conform to this state-mandated, sanitized version of equality, combined with the total marginalization of traditional masculine roles, contributes directly to a crisis of meaning and ultimately the staggering suicide rate.
And he sees this exact same penalization happening systemically in the United States workplace as well, particularly through the lens of affirmative action and diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives.
DEI is a major target in the book.
Riker argues that true meritocracy is dead, completely replaced by gender and diversity quotas. He points out that in universities and corporate hiring, especially in high-stakes, high-earning STEM fields, law and medicine, highly qualified male applicants are routinely passed over in favor of female candidates simply to meet corporate diversity targets.
He argues that men are being systematically locked out of the very institutions their ancestors built.
And it extends into scenarios where lowering standards actually costs lives.
But that terrifying part is his argument.
He points heavily to the military and fire departments, arguing that rigorous physical fitness standards have been deliberately and systematically lowered to ensure female integration and meet gender quotas.
And he claims this directly penalizes the men serving in those units.
Because they now have to rely on teammates who lack the biological upper body strength required to drag a wounded soldier out of a firefight or pull a citizen from a burning building. Riker views this as the ultimate proof that the system is willing to sacrifice male lives on the altar of a political illusion of equality.
And if a man dares to complain about any of this,
Oh, we know what happens then.
if he points out the lowered standards, or the hypocrisy in the dating market, or the bias in family court, Riker argues that he's met with the full destructive force of cancel culture.
He uses Dr. Jordan Peterson as a prime example of this phenomenon.
It's a perfect example for his thesis.
Here is a clinical psychologist advocating for personal responsibility, competence, and traditional values. And the moment he challenged feminist orthodoxy, gender ideology, and compelled speech, he was labeled a dangerous far-right misogynist.
Institutions tried to revoke his licenses, and he was banned from multiple platforms.
Meanwhile, Riker notes extreme, openly misandrist feminist views like hashtags calling for violence against men are routinely amplified and celebrated by those exact same tech platforms.
The irony Riker points out is that as men are pushed out of high-earning careers, silenced by tech monopolies, and stripped of their traditional identity, they are simultaneously targeted by a massive corporate machine designed to exploit their resulting insecurities.
The grooming industry.
He does a brilliant analysis of the $60 billion global male grooming industry. Brands like Axe, Calvin Klein, and various supplement companies. These corporations sell an impossible, digitally altered, globalized standard of beauty, and hyper-success.
It's preying on their vulnerability.
Riker cites a 2018 American Psychological Association study showing that men who actively try to conform to these globalized beauty and lifestyle standards suffer significantly higher rates of anxiety, body dysmorphia, and depression.
So it's a vicious, toxic loop.
The gynocentric society strips a man of his inherent worth and purpose, and then massive corporations step in to sell him expensive products to temporarily soothe the very insecurity the culture intentionally created.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because Conrad Riker doesn't just outline a depressing litany of problems. He doesn't just want men to be angry and hopeless.
No, he offers a way out.
He presents a very specific, actionable, and highly disciplined battle plan. This brings us to the culmination of the book, Section 5. The Red-Pilled Solution, M.G.T.O.W, Fatherhood, and the New Frontier.
This is the manifesto part of the edutainment manifesto.
Now, most of our listeners are already familiar with the broader M.G.T.O.W movement online, but Riker's specific iteration of it elevates it from an internet subculture into what he calls a strict survivalist discipline. Let's define the core philosophy of M.G.T.O.W men going their own way through Riker's lens.
For Riker, M.G.T.O.W is fundamentally a philosophy of extreme self-preservation and radical self-reliance. It is the conscious, calculated decision by men to completely and unapologetically reject a societal system that they believe is entirely rigged against them.
To take the red pill.
According to Riker, taking the red pill means waking up to the mathematical and legal reality of the gynocentric matrix. It means accepting, without emotion, that modern marriage and traditional dating are no longer romantic endeavors. They are highly dangerous financial and legal traps designed to extract male resources.
So if the game is rigged, the only way to win is to refuse to play.
Precisely. Therefore, the M.G.T.O.W philosophy encourages men to permanently opt out of the institution of marriage, avoid long-term cohabitation or any entanglements that risk their assets to common law statutes.
And what do they do instead?
They focus 100% of their time, energy, and money on their own self-improvement, attaining absolute financial independence, and establishing unbreakable personal boundaries. It is about starving the gynocentric system of the male utility it desperately needs to survive.
It's about taking total, uncompromising control of the one thing you can actually control in a chaotic world. Yourself.
That's the empowering core of it.
Well, what's incredibly interesting and what separates Riker from some of the more nihilistic voices on the internet is that while M.G.T.O.W advocates for walking away from toxic modern relationship dynamics and the legal trap of marriage, Riker fiercely and passionately defends the traditional role of fatherhood.
This surprises a lot of critics.
He doesn't hate families. He hates what the state has done to families. He argues that fathers are not disposable secondary caregivers. They are biologically and sociologically essential.
Yes, and he brings hard data to prove this point, making it clear that his philosophy is about protecting the future, not just selfish isolation.
He cites the National Fatherhood Initiative, right?
He cites a devastating 2016 study by the National Fatherhood Initiative. The data reveals that children raised in fatherless homes are 4 times more likely to end up in poverty or in the prison system.
4 times more likely.
They suffer higher rates of addiction, higher dropout rates, and more severe mental health crises. Riker uses this empirical data to argue that the systemic, state-sponsored removal of fathers from the home is actively destroying the next generation.
Facilitated by the biased family courts we talked about.
Biased family courts, no-fault divorce laws, and feminist narratives that claim women can do it all alone. The father, according to Riker, provides the essential discipline, boundary setting, and physical security that children require to develop properly.
And to rebuild that foundational strength in men who have been beaten down by the system, Riker points to the role of historical moral frameworks and religion.
Which is another interesting twist in a modern manifesto.
He specifically praises organizations like the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic fraternal organization founded in 1882. He notes that while secular institutions, universities, and governments have completely abandoned men or actively pathologized them, organizations like the Knights continue to quietly mentor young men.
Because they haven't caved to modern pressures.
They emphasize the exact traits the modern world hates: brotherhood, strict accountability, physical defense of the weak, and moral courage.
Riker argues that ancient religious frameworks like the Ten Commandments or the biblical story of David and Goliath aren't just old fairy tales to be discarded by a secular society.
They have real utility.
They are encoded roadmaps for masculine survival. They provide men with time-tested transcendent principles that allow them to stand firm and resolute against the chaotic, shifting noise and the impossible demands of a secular, gynocentric society.
It gives them an anchor.
When a man anchors himself to a higher moral truth, the temporary shaming tactics of modern cancel culture lose their power over him.
I want to spend a minute talking about the psychological transition Riker describes, moving from the blue pill illusion to the red pill reality. Because he makes it very clear in the text that it is not an easy or pleasant realization.
It's traumatic.
Waking up to the idea that you've been lied to your entire life, that the happy wife, happy life narrative is actually a recipe for indentured servitude, that the legal system views you as an ATM, and that your natural instincts are hated by the culture, is deeply jarring.
He describes a period of intense anger and grief that men go through.
But once a man crosses that threshold and accepts the reality, where does he go for support? Since the physical male spaces like the lodges and clubs have been destroyed, as we discussed earlier, Riker points to the digital frontier.
Yes, since the physical sanctuaries were outlawed or sued out of existence, the new tribes are forming rapidly online.
The new digital brotherhood.
Platforms like Reddit, specifically historical forums like r/M.G.T.O.W, various private Discord servers, and unfiltered message boards like 4chan have become the modern, digitized sanctuaries for men.
The media constantly paints those forums as radicalization zones.
But Riker brings fascinating academic data to back up the actual psychological value of these heavily criticized spaces. He cites a 2020 report published in the Journal of Men's Studies, which found that men who actively participate in these specific red-pilled online forums report significantly higher levels of daily life satisfaction and much lower levels of suicidal ideation and depression compared to men who remain isolated in the mainstream culture.
So Riker's data suggests they are actually life-saving support groups.
Exactly. Riker argues that these digital communities provide the exact things that were stolen from men in the physical world: unvarnished mentorship, brutal honesty about the realities of dating and divorce, and a sense of brotherhood where men can speak freely without the constant fear of being censored, shamed, or reported to HR by a gynocentric overseer.
To really bring all of these massive sociological, economic, and biological concepts together, Riker shares an incredibly powerful, detailed anecdote in the final chapters of the book about a man he simply calls John.
John's story is essentially the avatar for the entire modern men's movement.
John is a 35-year-old guy who did absolutely everything the Blue Pill Society told him to do. He went to college, kept his head down, got the stable corporate job, married his college girlfriend, and bought the overpriced house in the suburbs.
He was living the script.
But he ignored all the red flags because society told him to be accommodating. He endured his wife's constant criticism, her emotional manipulation, and her total lack of physical appreciation. He thought if he just provided more money, bought a nicer car, and was more sensitive, it would eventually get better.
And then, out of nowhere, she filed for divorce.
And this is where the Duluth model and the family courts we discussed earlier come into play. John's divorce proceeding was a slaughter.
Total devastation.
The family courts completely ruined him financially. He was ordered to pay exorbitant alimony that left him unable to afford his own apartment. He lost the house he paid for, and he was granted only alternate weekend visitation with his kids.
He was left financially devastated, emotionally shattered, and living in a cheap rental, contemplating suicide.
But that absolute destruction was his wake-up call. John discovers the red pill community online. He starts reading about the evolutionary psychology of hypergamy, and finally understands that his wife's loss of attraction wasn't because he wasn't sensitive enough, but because he had become a subservient beta male in her eyes.
He connected his personal pain to the broader theory.
He studies the legal biases that led to his ruin and realizes it wasn't a mistake. The system functioned exactly as designed, and instead of wallowing in despair or turning to substance abuse, he applies the M.G.T.O.W philosophy with militant precision.
He implements strict, unyielding physical and mental discipline. The book details how John starts waking up at 5 a.m. every single day to hit the gym, lifting heavy weights to reconnect with his physical masculinity.
No more grooming industry products for him.
He rebuilds his body, ignoring the grooming industry's soft aesthetics. He aggressively pursues new certifications, doubles his income, and most importantly, he radically alters his financial strategy.
How does he manage his money now?
He hoards his resources, invests quietly, and achieves total financial independence. He continues to be a rock-solid, disciplined father to his kids during his visitation time, but he fundamentally refuses to ever put himself in a position of legal, financial, or emotional vulnerability with a woman again.
He dates on his own terms.
Maintains absolute boundaries, and walks away at the first sign of manipulation. John's story is Riker's ultimate proof of concept. The gynocentric system will try to break you down and extract your resources, but the red pill discipline can rebuild you stronger, colder, and utterly untouchable.
It's an incredible cinematic narrative arc that really grounds the dense data of the book, and it makes you wonder about the long-term macro-level impact of all this.
It definitely forces us to speculate on the future.
If we look at the explosive trajectory of the M.G.T.O.W movement, it forces us to ask, will this remain a niche online subculture of men recovering from divorce, or is it going to become a massive mainstream lifestyle choice for the next generation of young men who see the trap before they even enter it?
Because of millions of young, capable men simply opt out of marriage, refuse to participate in the traditional dating market, and hoard their own economic resources instead of spending it on starting families, that fundamentally alters the future of the human race.
It collapses the housing market, it destroys consumer spending, and it plummets birth rates below replacement levels.
This raises an important question. If the entire gynocentric system, from the massive welfare state to the divorce industry to the corporate consumer economy, relies entirely on male taxation, male labor, and male participation in marriage to sustain itself, what happens when the primary engine of that system simply unplugs and walks away?
The system crashes.
Riker suggests that society is approaching a catastrophic breaking point. Eventually, the culture will be forced to capitulate and completely renegotiate the terms of gender dynamics, because the current system is mathematically, legally, and socially unsustainable without the willing participation of men.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Conrad Riker's M.G.T.O.W, the new masculine frontier. To summarize the incredible ground we've covered today, Riker presents a heavily documented, historically sweeping argument that men are living in a world where their natural instincts are pathologized and their historical contributions are intentionally erased.
He argues that our legal, educational, and economic institutions have been captured by a gynocentric ideology that demands absolute male sacrifice while offering zero respect or legal protections.
And his ultimate conclusion is that the only way to win a fundamentally rigged game is to stop playing it, walk away, and build a new, independent masculine frontier based on self-reliance, physical discipline, and an unbreakable digital brotherhood.
It is a profound, jarring, and unyielding critique of modern culture. And whether the mainstream media wants to acknowledge it or not, the data he presents regarding the biased legal system, the educational disparities destroying boys, and the terrifying realities of male mental health and suicide are realities that society can no longer afford to sweep under the rug.
Absolutely. The data speaks for itself.
Yeah.
And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've discussed today.
What's the thought?
We talked extensively about how physical male spaces like the Freemasons and private clubs have been deliberately dismantled by legislation, forcing men to find their brotherhood and mentorship through digital avatars and anonymous online forums like Reddit and Discord.
Right, the digital transition.
Here's the question for you to think about. If physical male spaces continue to vanish entirely, and the transfer of masculine wisdom is replaced completely by the internet, how will this disembodied brotherhood alter the evolutionary trajectory of masculinity in the physical world over the next century?
That's a fascinating concept.
Can a digitized, screen-based tribe truly replace the biological evolutionary necessity of shoulder-to-shoulder, real-world survival, and physical camaraderie? It's something to really think about as we watch this new frontier unfold.
We're watching it happen in real time.
Once again, if you found this deep dive valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to the show right now so we can keep bringing you this level of analysis. And remember, to truly understand the depth, the nuance, and the raw intensity of this movement, you need to read the source material directly for yourself.
You not let someone else summarize it for you.
We highly urge you to go and buy M.G.T.O.W, The New Masculine Frontier by Conrad Riker, which is available right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. And be sure to keep up with the author's ongoing unfiltered writings and research by following @Conrad Riker on Substack. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, for keeping an open mind, and for seeking out the unvarnished truth. We will see you next time.